A very good morning, good afternoon to Delhi, and I welcome you all to Россия сегодня News Agency in Moscow and to Sputnik India, and I have the pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's video conference. Today we will have a video conference between Moscow and New Delhi. We will discuss Russian-Indian relations. Tomorrow, on October 4th, President Putin will start his official visit to India, and during the upcoming visit, he will discuss Russian-Indian relations and the special privileged strategic partnership between the two countries. A number of documents are expected to be signed as part of the visit. For instance, we had a report that a contract of 5 missile complexes S-400 could be delivered to India, and this contract could be signed during this visit. And we will discuss Russian-Indian relations and cooperation. We will discuss bilateral projects, and of course we will also mention the international and regional agenda that, of course, will also be discussed during the upcoming talks between Russia and India. And I would like to introduce our speakers. I will start with Moscow. We have with us Associate Professor at the Institute of Asian and African Studies, Boris Volkhonsky, and I also welcome an expert from the Russian International Affairs Council, Professor at the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry and Senior Research Fellow at Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations, Mr. Andrei Volodin. And I welcome to our video conference Research Fellow at the National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations, Alexei Kupriyanov, and I would like to pass the floor to my colleague in Delhi who heads the Sputnik agency. Olga, could you introduce your speakers, please?
Our greetings from Delhi, Oksana, our respected speakers, our friends and colleagues, journalists. So let me represent Ambassador Ashok Mukherjee, Distinguished Fellow, Vivekananda International Foundation, former Indian Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Dr. Anirban Ganguly, Director of Dr. Shama Prasad Mukherjee Research Foundation, member of the Policy Research Department, Bharatiya Janata Party. Brigadier retired Rahul Phonsle, an Indian Army military veteran with 30 years active field experience in counter-militancy and terrorism operations. Nowadays, director of SasiaSecurityRisks.com, focusing on strategic culture and security trends in South Asia, future warfare and human security. Oksana?
Thank you so much for the introduction. So let's start our conversation. We will proceed, we will take turns between Moscow and Delhi, between their remarks. I will ask you to be relatively brief so that we can have Q&A and some interactive conversation, and maybe you will not agree on all the points that we will be discussing. So let's start with Moscow, as we usually do. What is your perspective on the current state of Russian-Indian relations, and what do you expect from this upcoming visit? Thank you so much, Oksana, and good morning and good afternoon to New Delhi. So I think that we all know that the level of Russian-Indian relations is pretty high. It is quite natural that always we are looking for improvements, for ways to make our relations better and to make additional efforts. But the signals that we have been receiving from India over the last few months show that we can achieve progress during the upcoming visit by Vladimir Putin and to make an important step in developing our relations. We can come to a better understanding on regional and international developments, and if it happens, we can also achieve a breakthrough in our military technical cooperation, which has quite a long history and a long track record, and this history is quite positive. And I think my colleagues will agree with me. We have very positive expectations ahead of the meeting between President Putin and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. I will now pass the floor to Delhi. Olga, please, you will moderate your side of the conversation. Mr. Volodin said that we can make a new step in developing Russian-Indian relations during the upcoming visit. So what is the perspective of the Indian experts? What do your speakers think about these relations, and what areas of bilateral cooperation are the most interesting for India, please?
Dear speakers, who would be the first to start the discussion? Ambassador Mukherjee.
Well, I think that this is the 19th summit meeting between India and Russia, and I think that the first thing we must remember is that with no other country has India such a sustained interaction at the summit level in an annual basis. The results of these summits have been visible. For example, Russia is the only country which is currently participating in the construction of nuclear power reactors in India, which will help India to meet its renewable and non-fossil fuel energy goals. It is also a concrete example of the transfer of technology and of the development of skilled manpower in India, which carries forward a long-standing tradition in our relationships, which marked 70 years not a few months ago. As far as this meeting is concerned, I think it is taking place at a very important juncture of international relations. The informal summit which took place earlier this year in Sochi between President Putin and Prime Minister Modi has already indicated that one of the areas which India and Russia will discuss closely in this summit will be how to cooperate in specific ways on upholding a multipolar and multilateral world order. And if we go by the statement made by India at the recent session of the UN General Assembly, our commitment to multilateralism is a commitment which we have reiterated and which we are trying to demonstrate in various areas. With the cooperation of Russia, I think that this is an area which will have a very big significance in terms of the international relationship and international relations structure that we see today. The second area which will be focused upon is the participation of both countries in their national socio-economic development programs. I think the time has come for us to see what we can do in Russia as it is for Russia to see what it can do in India. And I think there are several areas, several proposals which have been discussed in the joint commissions which met not long ago between our two countries, with a focus, for example, on Indian participation in the development of the Russian Far East. There are some areas which are important for India. We have already seen the beginning of cooperation in joint cooperation in the supply and processing of raw minerals such as diamonds. The diamonds are coming from the Russian Far East, are being brought into India and are being polished and exported to the global market. So this is the kind of cooperation that we have actually seen happening on the ground. Not long ago, in the Russian Far East, India's first investment was in Sakhalin, and although there was some issues relating to areas of Sakhalin which had to be regularized. I'm happy to note from the media reports that the Indian companies involved with Rosneft have agreed to resolve these issues, and therefore that gives us an even stronger basis to look at furthering our cooperation in the energy sector with the Russian Far East in focus. So the third area, which I think is important and which we need to focus on now, is to restore the people-to-people contact between India and Russia. 75% of India's population was born after 1990, after Russia became independent. And I think it is important for us in India to find ways through the summit discussions to restore the connections between our two peoples using the different areas in which we have always collaborated, whether they were in culture, art, films, painting, or social sciences. There are so many areas in which India and Russia have known each other for centuries, and I think that this summit gives us an occasion to focus on this area as well.
Mr. Ganguly, General Consul, do you have to add something?
That's right. I think the Ambassador has very aptly summed up how the India-Russia relations have flowered over the years. I'd like to highlight two major aspects. One is the geopolitical environment which is existing today. It is a fragmented universe. Multipolarity is collapsing or collapsed. Some countries are adopting a very unilateralist position, I would say protectionist position. And in this sort of a situation, it is important for India and Russia to act as a beacon of multilateralism. Having said that, also there are existing pressures both on Russia and India to join certain blocs and groups, which I think both are very aptly resisting. And that is where I think we have to continue our bilateral relations as well as contribute to multilateralism. Now, second aspect I would like to highlight is basically regarding the India-Russia military-to-military cooperation. I think we are seeing this trajectory of this cooperation going upwards each year. And it's not going to be relations between a buyer and a seller as it is felt. It is a relation between two strategic partners, two defense strategic partners who are now getting closely into joint manufacturing, not only joint manufacturing of major platforms or joint projects such as the BrahMos missile, but we are now getting into the manufacturing of the supply chain networks. So today we are in a situation where there will be such a collaboration in the military sphere that we are going to be acting as true partners, and we will be able to benefit from each other's strengths. And I think that is a direction which I think is very fruitful, and we must look forward to further the advancements in this, particularly during the summit. We are quite sure that some of the important the defense issues which are there on the table, they will be inked and resolved. Thank you.
Yes,
I just want to make two points, and I want to start with being a little emotional. I think this is the first summit which will be held in the physical absence of our late former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And why I name Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee is because, as is known, it was his vision and his partnership with President Putin that started off, that launched this series of annual summits. And I think he had recognized at that point of time in the year 2000, when the global situation was extremely fluid, and we were both as countries, as civilizations, passing through a phase of first transition. He had recognized this crucial importance, the centrality in a rapidly changing global scenario of India-Russia relationship. And today, I think Prime Minister Modi has beautifully defined it when he said that our relationship covers the dimensions from Sanskriti, from culture, to Suraksha, that is defense. And each of these parameters, each of these dimensions, as far as our two countries are concerned, are dynamic and evolving and not stagnant. And therefore, one is the continuity, uninterrupted continuity of these summits, which are symbolic of where our relationship stands. And B, as Ambassador Mukherjee said, reconnecting the people-to-people dimension is, I think, extremely important. And I think both leaders have not only emphasized that in the past, Prime Minister Modi's speech at the St. Petersburg annual summit in 2017, where he emphasized on this aspect. And I think it is in this people-to-people connect, redefining, restating, and re-articulating, that a great possibility and strength lies ahead for us.
Moscow?
Yes, thank you so much. We heard the expectations of our Indian speakers about Russian-Indian relations. Mr. Volkhonsky, what are Russia's interests? What topics is Russia interested in? And what are your expectations for this visit? The previous speakers had said a lot of important things, but here's what I wanted to highlight. The contract to deliver S-400 missile complexes is very much anticipated and expected contract, and it is a very important element of military technical cooperation between Russia and India. There was some unfair competition that we have faced when India there were attempts to force India to buy American systems, but of course geopolitical pressure is very much important, and that some forces do not want India to be a strategic partner for Russia. Here's what I wanted to highlight. This is a long story that we have been observing over the past few years. Military technical cooperation, as important as it is, and I recognize it's important, it has overshadowed some other important aspects of our cooperation, and our colleagues have mentioned people-to-people contact. So this is an important subject, of course. And this is a very interesting topic too. When you go to India in the winter, all the airplanes are filled with people, with Russian people who want to travel to India to visit various corners of this country and to learn about various aspects of India as a country, as a culture. But the thing that we have yet to address is that the lack of connectivity, I'm referring to geographical connectivity. We do not share a border with Uzbekistan. We do not have a border either, but we have enhanced connectivity through Kazakhstan. But with India, the situation is different because the direct ways through Pakistan and Afghanistan, and of course this route is of course not preferable. There's this long-standing project of international north-south transport corridor. A couple of years ago I took part in a very important conference, and it was discussed that only 100 kilometers of rail need to be constructed in Iran, but the project is still in the making, so if it works, it's only being tested, so we need to enhance connectivity between the two countries. And I think this is the issue that we need to address and that both countries have to address. So this is not a purely economic project, but of course it will have a major economic impact in terms of improving trade between the two countries. But this is all. There is also a geostrategical dimension to this project, and it will be able to help us resolve many issues that we face in our bilateral relations. Thank you so much. And Mr. Kupriyanov, your colleague, mentioned the lack of connectivity between India and Russia, and he called for promoting the north-south transport corridor. But now India and Pakistan are members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so maybe some issues can be addressed as part of this framework. What are your expectations from this visit? maybe you have something to add to what has been said. I have little to add after my colleagues. All I can say is that North-South corridor will not work unless it is needed in terms of economic development. So far, what we have to offer to India and what India has to offer to Russia is limited to just certain products, and I hope that the upcoming talks between India and the Eurasian Economic Union will provide this economic foundation for developing this North-South transport corridor. And I do hope that as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization we'll be able to reach some breakthrough solutions, that it will serve as a platform for addressing a number of relevant issues. And we are seeing signs of improving relations between India and Pakistan, and we hope that this trend carries on. And I would like to come back to Mr. Volodin. You have started, I would like to ask you a question. We need this North-South corridor to be economically relevant. What are the other aspects of bilateral cooperation where we do not have as much progress as we would want? Mr. Kupriyanov was right when he said about the economic relevance for Russia and for India of this North-South transport corridor. But I would add to this the transition to new settlement framework between India and Russia. We are discussing about stopping to use dollars in our economy, and this is not because Russia has some problems with the United States. In 2016, all international settlements, 80% of international settlements were carried out in US dollars. So 20% are either Swiss francs, euros, Singaporean dollars, or national currencies. In the Soviet era, in our settlements with India, we had a clearing system, and later, when the so-called liberal reforms got underway, this system was cancelled. But this system was very much important because we were able to buy from India products that we needed, and India purchased products from Russia, and they had settlements in national currencies. But there is a caveat. It was on a number of occasions I discussed this issue with our Indian friends and colleagues, and they said that there is the real value of the Russian ruble. One of prominent Indian experts, we know that the ruble is underestimated. This is a challenge for financial regulators, above all for Russia, and I think that settlements in national currency will help improve and further develop our relations. Another aspect, following up at what Mr. Kupriyanov said, there is this complex triangle, or maybe even complex settlements that are going on. I would like to remind our listeners in Moscow and in Delhi is that in the Soviet times there was a very interesting and a very effective triangle: Moscow, Baghdad, Delhi. We supplied weapons to Iraq. Iraq supplied oil to India, and this is a very high quality oil, and India supplied products that the Soviet Union needed. So this model of clearing settlement, well, I think that the clearing is a good term to use. So we are starting to see this with Indonesia, and I think that with India we also need to come back to this experience. Thank you so much. So I turn back to Delhi. So what do our distinguished Indian speakers think about settlements in national currencies and the prospects of cooperation between India and the Eurasian Economic Union. And of course, you can follow up on what your Russian colleagues have said. Please go ahead.
Well, I think the points made by our friends in Moscow are very, very interesting and relevant points. They underline the priorities that exist on the agenda, which the summit will look at. I agree that connectivity is a major issue which India and Russia have to discuss. And connectivity today is not only through the current alignment of the North-South corridor, which goes through Iran, but there's an alternative connectivity of the North-South corridor using the land route, which goes through Azerbaijan and up into Russia, which is also being looked at. So we have now two alternatives for the alignment of the North-South transport corridor, but as has been said by our colleagues who are economists, a lot will depend on what are the products which will be transported along this corridor, and how will this corridor help greater people-to-people contacts. I think that was where we started this discussion on connectivity from. And in terms of greater people-to-people contacts, the air links are very important. We have seen a surge in the air connectivity between India and Central Asia in the last 1.5 years. And I think that it should be possible for our aviation companies to actually use this development to increase the greater contact between people from India and Russia using Central Asia as a hub. And that is one option that is very much possible. As you know, the aviation sector in India has witnessed a very dramatic growth. And I think this is something that will benefit the India-Russia relationship for greater people-to-people contacts. I would like to also turn for using this air connectivity to the focus on the Russian Far East. I see no reason why, for example, we cannot see the development of a tourism corridor between Irkutsk and Delhi. This is something that is possible using Central Asia as a hub, and which will in turn contribute to the development of the tourism infrastructure in Irkutsk and further beyond Irkutsk to the Russian Far East. The second area where we have not looked at, but probably the time is coming for us to look at, is to begin connectivity using the maritime route from Vladivostok to Chennai. That is a route which is now being developed for transporting of energy from Russian Far East to India, but there is no reason why it should be limited only to cargo tankers for energy. It should also be looked at in terms of passenger transport from that part of Russia to India, and probably linking it with the Trans-Siberian Railway network for greater tourism cooperation. I would like to address the second issue of financial settlements and use of national currencies. I think one factor which today gives us a new scope for discussion and carrying this issue forward is the factor of India being a country which has consciously put in place the use of digital currency, digital economy. You have seen global reports about the way in which India has graduated towards becoming, inside our country, inside our economy, a cashless economy. That is the policy that we are following. And if we use the digital method of settling accounts, then this is a dimension which we haven't looked at before, but which gives us a possibility to bring it up to the 21st century. And in its own way, it can contribute also to taking care of some of the problems which are associated with the old way of settling accounts using national currencies or using commodities, oil, etc., because the digital way of accounting is something that is new and that should be looked at. And for those who have any concerns on the misuse of this digital route for other purposes, I would just point to the fact that India is a member of the Eurasian group, which is headquartered in Moscow, which is responsible for ensuring that financial transactions that take place do take place within the letter of the law and are not misused for financing of terrorism or financing of drug trafficking. So the digital route is something that we need to look at, and I think this is something that should be done. And the third area which was mentioned was the Eurasian Economic Union. As you know, the two leaders agreed that we should move ahead on discussing the framework for an India-Eurasian Economic Union free trade agreement. I think the models that have been entered into by the Eurasian Economic Union with Singapore and with Vietnam, which have been mentioned in our newspapers, give us a way in which we can actually do this concretely, because, as you know, India has integrated its economy to a very large extent with the economy of ASEAN in the last 20 years, and our Act East policy, which is there today, builds on this integration of the Indian economy with the economy of the ASEAN countries. So if Singapore and Vietnam have got free trade agreements with the Eurasian Economic Union, then that gives India a guide map on how we can enter into and conclude FTA with the Eurasian Economic Union as well. Thank you.
Do you want to add something? Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much, Olga, because I think one of the important aspects that has to be emphasized as far as multilateralism is concerned, we have got too much emphasis on the political multilateralism. Just political multilateralism is not going to work unless, as our honorable delegates from Moscow have suggested, we also have such financial and economic and the banking multilateralism. Today, the entire financial system is a unilateral system which can get controlled or can get sucked in by the controls which are exercised from countries as United States and the SIP systems such as SWIFT. Now, when you are talking of multilateralism, we have to build parallel mechanisms in the financial, in the banking and economic sectors. And that is where we have to look at, so that ultimately we are not dependent on a single entity for our financial transactions. And that is a larger picture, which I think we have to look at, rather than trying to find smaller solutions like a rupee-ruble trade and the third-party trade, etc., etc. Of course, in the immediate term, this situation will continue. But when we are looking at a summit which is going to happen tomorrow and day after, I think we have to look at what larger solutions our leadership can find out, and what way we can really have actual multilateralism which is desirable in the world, so that every pole in this multilateral system is equally powerful. And it's not that some poles are getting stronger than the others. And I think Russia and India can really exercise their influence to create such mechanisms and to make this happen. For example, let me switch to the military field. In the military field, as I said earlier, we are not having a buyer and seller relationship. We are increasingly going out for joint production, joint manufacturing, and even joint development of products. Now, if that is the type of relationship we are having, then obviously you can have always this settlement issue can be well resolved by India being a supplier to the Russian military and industry. And of course, Russia is supplying the platforms and other equipments to the Indian industry, which is already doing. But India can also turn into a supplier to the Russian industries, and the Indian manufacturing sector, the defense sector, as has been emphasized in the Make in India program, which has been launched by our Prime Minister Modi, is getting stronger and stronger. And the defense manufacturing, where we have the public sector enterprises, the private sector enterprises, today is acting as, is forming a major portion of the supply chain, global supply chain per se. Now, if that is the type of relationship which we can develop, which will happen very soon and very shortly, because we have already inked a number of agreements. Moscow, the Rosoboron export is very effectively participating in a number of agreements with the Indian manufacturers. And I think this sort of a settlement in the defense field, one can envisage, and then you can take it on in the other spheres also. Thank you.
Сейчас они передадут слово.
Moscow?
Yes, thank you so much. Mr. Volodin, you asked for the floor. Thank you so much. I would like to follow up on what Mr. General started about the fragmentation of the current world order, we have to understand that this multipolar world order already exists. There is no bipolar world order, there's no unipolar world order, but this multipolar order is developing, is very chaotic, so we cannot see any very specific trends that will lead to a new world order. And in this respect, cooperation between Russia and India is extremely important. At the same time, we have to understand that this interaction has to be trust-based and has to cover and include not only summit meetings between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. This trust-based relationships must also exist in military-to-military channels, on foreign policy elites and foreign trade elites. And I think that it is essential that we need to promote contacts between the intellectual elites of the two countries. So I'm referring to academic contacts between Russian and Indian academia, because these meetings, track 2, track 1.5, they have their advantages, but when we talk about specific plans for the future, the contacts between academia are essential. So any follow-up comments from the Russian side? Another topic that was not raised today, and we discussed this at other video conferences, there is a huge potential in developing contacts not only on state-to-state level, but also on the interregional level. Russia and India are federations, are federative states, so every region has some autonomy and can act. When Prime Minister Modi was at the head of Gujarat state, he had contacts with the Astrakhan region. This is one of the few examples of such cooperation. There are a number of agreements that exist in this area, but so far we have not seen too many specific projects that were implemented on this track. So you mentioned interregional cooperation, and our guests in Delhi said that India is interested in working in the far east of Russia. And so how well is Russian businesses represented in India? How easy it is for Russians to work in India? Yes, this is a very relevant question that we discussed it informally. This is quite a delicate situation. We see Make in India program, and we see that foreign direct investments are being facilitated between the two countries. But there is a subjective factor. What do Russian businesses think about working with India, not on the state level, not with government institutions? All these government contacts are very effective, but I'm referring to business contacts between Russia and India. And in this respect, I wanted to say to our Indian colleagues and friends is that there is some caution among Russian business people. This refers to AFK Sistema company or a number of other cases. I know that one of your former ambassadors to Moscow, Al-Jaimal Khodra, had very positive relations with Mr. Lysin from Novolipetsk Metal Works. And these personal contacts paved the way to the fact that this Novolipetsk Metal Works was ready to work is India. And the more we have partnerships of this kind, especially in the regions, the better. But at the same time, we have to have a very clear understanding not only of the Indian businesses, but of the Indian regions and their potential. And to the same extent, India needs information about Russia. Mr. Kupriyanov, please, I would like to follow up on what Mr. Volodin said. The main question is that Indian businessmen do not know Russia very well, and the same applies to Russian businessmen who do not know India very well. So in this respect, I'm not blaming the academia of the two countries for that, but maybe the media bear part of the blame for not informing our communities enough. Another important subject is the educational potential. Narendra Modi announced a number of reforms, including the Make in India program, and among other projects, there is this project on professional training, professional retraining. Millions of people, tens of millions of people will learn new skills in order to be able to operate in the new Indian economy. And Russia, I believe, could contribute to this process by inviting more Indian colleagues, Indian students to Russia, by operating its own educational centers in India. So this is something that both India and Russia could benefit from. And this could expand Russia's knowledge about the future Indian elite and those who will develop business operations in India. In Soviet times, many Indian people from India came to Soviet universities to get their education. There are fewer Indian students right now. Well, it did not happen today. It happened in the 1990s. We are seeing positive momentum right now, but this should not be just about some regional or partial programs. This should be a national major effort. So our colleagues in Moscow noted the lack of information on both sides. And I think Mr. Volhonsky also mentioned about pressure on India regarding military technical cooperation with Russia. And there was a report that Washington wanted to punish India for buying S-400 missile systems. So this pressure by the United States to promote the interests, that's what they do across the world, and this is not a secret. So it seems that India was not afraid of any sanctions from the United States for buying the S-400. So could our Indian colleagues comment on this subject, please? You have the floor.
Well, I think in response to the question that you've just put, the best answer I can give is to quote the Foreign Minister of India, Mrs. Sushma Swaraj, who said that India has always abided by United Nations sanctions, but India has never agreed to implement unilateral sanctions. And I think that that is something that is very important, because people who know India know about the fierce independence that we have, which we have protected and nurtured ever since we got independence from colonial rule in 1947. We are not interested in replacing one kind of colonial rule with some new colonial rule in which we are expected to be a party. So I think that this answer is very clear. And I would say that because of its objective factors, the India-Russia relationship, even including the defense relationship, on which Brigadier will talk more, stands on its own feet. And it stands on its own feet because it is unique among all the other defense relationships that we have. India-Russia defense relationship is the only relationship which has actually transferred technology on the ground to India and generated employment in Russia. Most people forget that when we brought the first of our new systems, whether they were the frigates, whether they were the T-90 tanks, whether they were the Sukhoi aircraft, at that time in Russia, there was a severe crisis for employment in those factories and enterprises. And it was a signal of the trust that exists in the India-Russia relationship that the Indian investments in buying those platforms helped to keep those enterprises and those workers and their families going through a very difficult time. And we are grateful from our side that Russia has, without any issue, transferred the technologies which have been developed by Russian research and innovation into Indian public sector enterprises and now into Indian private sector enterprises. So this is the symbol of the trust which cannot be shattered by threats of unilateral sanctions from any other country in the world. And I think that this is something that we need to emphasize. I'd like to go to one point which was made before about contacts between regions and provinces of India and Russia. And I think the example given by our colleague from Moscow was very good, the Gujarat-Astrakhan relationship, which was signed by Prime Minister Modi when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat and the governor of Astrakhan at that time. And one area which unfortunately did not show much progress at that time, but which can be brought back to the table today, is cooperation in sustainable fisheries. It was made by Astrakhan at that time. The offer was made to India to collaborate on developing farming of sturgeon fish, which produces caviar as well, in India. They had identified the locations in India where they wanted to collaborate, but at that time, India was not ready for such cooperation. Today, India is ready because under Prime Minister Modi, we have a policy which is called cooperative federalism. And under cooperative federalism, the main beneficiary has been the states of India, which are now getting the share of the federal budget, which earlier used to be distributed on a planned basis through the Planning Commission. Now it goes to them on a different direct basis without the intervention of the Planning Commission. And I think that this has empowered states which are now able to follow up their interests in collaboration with the budget and the money that they need to invest in such collaboration. And I think that that's something that is important. And the last thing that I wanted to respond to was the point made about professional training. And I think that this is a very, very important area. In a presentation I heard from Rosatom recently in New Delhi, I was glad to note that they have taken the initiative to also start financing educational institutions in India which will produce the skilled manpower which is needed by India to operate the nuclear reactors that are being built by Rosatom in India. Now, this is the kind of thing that no other country is going to do for India, which Russia is doing today. And I think that it's important that we talk about these things in a more wider format. Thank you.
I just wanted to actually bring about certain points that Ambassador Mukherjee also has made. You see, the observation was made that the evolution of a multipolar world order, the evolution is extremely chaotic. I think that's only natural because the going away of a particular structure and the evolution of a new one is obviously going to be an extremely chaotic one. And I agree with this point that we are already a multipolar structure. In fact, to echo the expression of Ambassador Ivashchenko, he prefers to refer to it as multi-centered rather than multipolar. But the point here is that the strength of our relationship and its continuing evolution is going to be a reflection of the strength of a multipolar world order. And the test of our relationship is how we together evolve that world order and sustain it, which is extremely important. And here the challenge is that, as you're right, that we know post-Cold War, there's very little that we know of each other. There's this entire generation which has come up on either side, and a lot of the information that we get about Russia is rooted through the West, which is unreliable to a great, in a number of ways. And therefore, I think this articulation that you have made, that not only summits, military to military cooperation is obviously important, but foreign policy elites, intellectual elites, and the academia, I think there should be, whatever you call it, track 4, track 5, track 6, I think there should be parallel efforts in all these dimensions, under all these fields, to continue an exploration of minds. India doesn't suffer from Russophobia in a sense. A large section of the intelligentsia in the West may be suffering from it, but we in India don't. But what the challenge before is to rediscover ourselves post-Cold War. And I think therefore, like in a recently concluded international seminar that we held in Delhi, and where the Russian International Affairs Council collaborated with us, including the Russian embassy, very interesting suggestions had come up. For example, Ambassador Mukherjee suggested that we should have a regular dialogue, India-Russia dialogue, on trying to understand the evolution and structure of the Indo-Pacific. Similarly, I had suggested that we should have a group of eminent intellectuals who keep meeting on a regular basis. It need not be a government-to-government effort. It can be a spontaneous effort of various organizations where we continue with the exploration of the minds, which is extremely important to situate our partnership, to dynamize our partnership, and to calibrate it in a multipolar world. And I think that is what we want. We want a multipolar world. We want a world, and where Prime Minister Modi says, where no alliance is directed against any other, and we believe in that. Our stand in the Southeast Asian, in the ASEAN region, has reflected that. Prime Minister Modi in his Shangri-La dialogue has articulated it. And I think when it comes to India and Russia relationship, that stands as well. But I think these are certain explorations that we need to do, and we need to do in a very constructive and in a very sustained manner. And I think therefore, think tank to think tank, academia to academia, intellectual to eminent citizens, there has to be a sustained outreach, exchange and interaction at various levels over the next few years, and so that we can really strengthen each other's presence in the minds of our youth. This is the point I really wanted to make.
Very good. Mr. Chancellor.
I think some very excellent ideas have come up. Let me just contribute in a small way. Firstly, I'll focus on the issues which have emerged regarding the military-to-military cooperation. Now, as far as sanctions are concerned, or let's say sanctions, or as far as the arms procurement are concerned, we have to understand two aspects. One is the commercial agreements. Now, in a commercial agreements, it is an open competition. So that is a different set by itself. And where you find that some of the Russian companies have done very well, some of them have not done very well. Now that is the way India has looking at from a commercial point of view, and that does not actually impact our strategic relationship, because that is a commercial aspect which will carry on its own. So we should not confuse that with our strategic partnership. The second aspect is the government-to-government, the defense procurement which is ongoing. Now in this, the issue of sanctions doesn't arise. Because as my honorable colleagues have already explained, that India is not going to agree to sanctions by anybody on the plea of whatever they want to have on their own side, this CAATSA and other things which are being talked about. I think that does not hold value for us. And not only our foreign minister, our defense minister has very categorically stated that India is a sovereign country, and India will exercise its sovereignty as far as its defense contracts or any other field is concerned. So I think my only request is, let us separate the two. Let's not go to the commercial, and then government-to-government contracts, I think, will go through, and I'm quite hopeful that we'll see some good light coming out of the summit which is going to take place tomorrow and the after. The second aspect which came up is, I do agree that unfortunately today's discussion we are completely focused on the defense sales and the technical cooperation. But let me tell you that our interaction at the military level is very strong. In fact, today the Indian Army Chief, General Rawat, he is there in Moscow. He visited the Artillery Academy in Moscow. He is there. Just yesterday, our Air Force team, which was was coming back from Moscow, they attended the Avia India exercise. Last year, we had the first, all three services in India, they participated in the first joint exercise with Russia. So our interaction is not only restricted to the military technical cooperation, there are interaction is happening in the various other spheres also, but somehow we find that the military technical cooperation, it gets a larger portion of whenever we engage in this environment. And now the SCO has provided us a very good forum where we did the SCO exercise, first time India joined the SCO exercise, and that was a very rich experience which has been generated. Now, this is as far as the defense aspect is concerned. Now, let me talk about the multipolar order, and I've got my own views on this and some major differences with our friends across the board. Because, as I said earlier, politically we are emerged or emerging into multipolar order. But financially and economically, there's no multipolar order. As our delegates from Moscow, they said 80% of the finances and banking control still lies with certain countries. So what is this multipolarism when 80% is concentrated in the hands of one country or a group of countries? I think that is where I feel that we must work towards that. And if you want to have real multilateralism, it has to be spread across the board. Thank you.
Delhi, any other contributions? Okay, turning to Moscow, any comments from you? Please turn on your mic. I would like to follow up on the last remarks by the Brigadier General. It is correct that in political terms the world is multipolar, in financial terms not yet, but we have to understand that we inherited a specific situation. In 1971 the United States under Nixon gave up on the pegging the dollar to other currencies, and it seems as an advent of the multipolar world in the financial sector. But in 1972 there was this agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The King Faisal who signed this agreement for Saudi Arabia, and this agreement stated that oil will be traded in US dollars. And of course, this decision undermined this establishment of a multipolar financial order and reversed this process. But we have a very interesting example that is at odds at what our Indian colleagues said. For example, there is this project Yamal LNG, which involves Russia, China, South Korea, and Total, the French company. This project, the settlements under this project are in euros. So this shows that we do not have to be limited to US dollars in our settlements, and the idea is to not to move away from dollars in an instant. This is just impossible, but we need to act, advance stage by stage, gradually. Any other comments, Mr. Kupriyanov? I would like to also follow up on what His Excellency Mr. General said. The General mentioned our bilateral and joint exercises. This is very well, but this is not enough. All our exercises are just bilateral. If we look at all the exercises that India has, this is just a very small share. We do not have any bilateral format that for example, India has bilateral exercises with many countries. Why do not we have exercises between Russia, India, and Vietnam? All these countries are our strategic partnership, and we have bilateral exercises with these countries separately, but not together. So let's move on to Q&A. Give the floor to our journalists if they have any questions. Please, the first row in Moscow. As you have said, Mr. Volodin said, talked about the triangle Moscow, Baghdad, Delhi. This is a very interesting idea. And China, Kuwait, Moscow, another triangle. So there are two triangles. Do you see any competition between India and China in the economy? So all these countries are part of the BRICS, so maybe this could become an opportunity to promote contacts within BRICS. What do you think about this? This is a question to everyone, so Mr. Volodin, yes, I think that as I have said, all the new developments we have is something that we actually already had in the past. So there was this idea by Emmanuel Todd, the free geometry of international relations, this concept. So when the relations are not driven by ideology, but by interests, and are driven by avoiding hurting your long-standing partners. I do believe that Russian diplomacy and the economic diplomacy that is becoming increasingly influential in the overall Russian diplomatic position takes this into consideration. We do understand that there may be some challenges between India and some of its neighbors, and we do everything we can, and we cannot interfere in these relations, but we can do what we can in order to improve these relations and to make them predictable. And I can only quote from Minister Lavrov, who said that the economy is playing an increasingly important role in political diplomacy. Yes, and Mr. Volhonsky, if we discuss these relations in the triangle Russia, India, China, we will have to have another roundtable discussion, a video conference. We have not mentioned China at all since we're talking about Russian-Indian relations, but it is obvious that despite all the challenges that exist between India and China, in one thing our interests converge is that we all oppose a unilateral world order, and we want to have a multipolar, a polycentric world order. And the fact that India, China, and Russia are part of the BRICS, of the SCO, and of the G20, this is a very positive fact, and it helps us improve our relations, not within these three countries, and also this RIC, Russia, India, China format that is virtually part of the BRICS. And there is also countries like Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia. And we can talk at length about this, and I will stop at that. Mr. Kupriyanov, I can say that we are seeing an economic rapprochement between India and China. It is not very obvious so far, but it is obvious. Trade, if we look at trade volumes, maybe our colleagues have better numbers. In 2016, trade was over 70 billion. In 2017, it was $80 billion, and now they're about to reach 90 billion. China is increasing its investment in India, and last year it was $13 billion, up from $3 billion a year earlier. So this year there is a chance that the investment will exceed $20 billion. And despite all the political differences between India and China, despite the border crisis and other challenges, and we see that there is an economic foundation for this cooperation, and it emerges, and this is visible. So this was also a question for Delhi. Please, could you briefly answer this question?
Yes, sure.
Well, I think that we also see interaction between India and China, India and Russia, not only in the bilateral framework, but also in the group framework, which you have mentioned, like the RIC, the SCO, the BRICS, and the G20, and so on. But one thing that you may like to note, which has happened, is that India, China, India, Russia probably are also following a similar approach, because with both countries there have been informal summits this year between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. So over and above the structured interaction, bilateral and plurilateral, multilateral, there is also this new dynamic which has come into our relations through the informal summit mechanism. And the informal summit mechanism is important because it gives flexibility to the leadership of all the countries, the three countries concerned, to respond to new challenges which come up during the period between the structured summits that take place. And I think that this is, as has been said, after both these informal summits, the leaders have agreed to continue with this mechanism. So that is something that I think is important. I agree with the view that the economic relationship is a big driver, as Foreign Minister Lavrov has said. The economic relationships really expand the political and bilateral relations between countries. With China, India's economic relationship is very large. There is a trade imbalance which is being addressed, but the fact remains that today China is a very large player in the Indian economy, and India is trying to be a large player in those areas of the Chinese economy where India has access. There is an issue of access which is being negotiated with China. We would like to see a similar dynamic with Russia. And I think the point that was made earlier by the panel in Moscow about greater dynamism in our business-to-business relationship is something that needs to be looked at. And it also needs to be looked at as to why the structure which was set up by a previous summit for bringing the chief executive officers of companies from both countries together has not given the kind of dynamism which the leaders of the two countries expected. And perhaps the time has come, given the way the world has moved, to looking at a supplementary initiative to bring the small and medium enterprises of Russia and India together. We have not been able to do this in a structured way. Small and medium enterprises in India were looking to get a supportive framework for interacting with Russia through a financial institution like a banking mechanism. We do not have a India-Russia bank for investments. So they looked at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which was active in Russia. But now that European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is not active anymore in Russia following their own problems in the European Union, we need to look at what are the other options. One option is the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, and even the New Development Bank, which is being promoted by the BRICS. So probably this is something that can be given as a project to these financial institutions in the SCO or BRICS format, or even among the RIC format, for how to bring small and medium enterprises into this relationship. Because the fact remains that the bulk of the economic activity in the Indian economy is conducted by small and medium enterprises. So without them, you cannot really expect the dynamism that we expect in the India-Russia economic relationship.
Yes, colleagues.
See, the point is, what I feel, strategically, India and Russia are on the same boat, and we have been here. Not picking up, despite so much of push from the highest level. Think tanks are meeting, our civil services, foreign services, everybody's meeting each other. Economically, the economic organizations are meeting, the business organizations are meeting, but practically, I think we are lacking this momentum. And to build up that practical momentum, as Ambassador has pointed out regarding the small-scale industries, etc., I think a lot of hard work is necessary. So, just having a summit once in a year, but the follow-up of the summit and a lot of hard work is required for us to really go down to the grassroots and make a big impact. And that is where I think we have to really focus on. Thank you.
Olga Vladimirovna.
Olga, we have 15 minutes left. Any questions from Delhi?
I would ask colleagues. Please represent yourself.
Hello, I'm Bijendra Singh, head of the foreign desk of Sahara News Network. And my question is, how do you foresee the future of India-Russia defense ties in view of US laws and US pressure? Because defense ties is the core of India-Russia relations. And I think for this time, India has got some waivers from US, but for the next defense ties, there will be some problems. So what that will be the views of you?
Moscow, or my colleagues here in Delhi, who would start?
Ну, начинайте вы, только, пожалуйста.
Please go ahead, but please, brief questions, brief answers. We have very little time. Please, Delhi, go ahead. Да. Да. Пока что мы не имеем возможности...
This whole issue. And even if, let's say, tomorrow the United States plans to put sanctions on some of the Indian entities, like they've done in China, from EDD, one of the entities in China they've done. But they may be sort of cutting their own feet, because some of our defense sales agreements are also with the United States. So tomorrow, if the United States blocks for example, places sanctions on the DRDO, or places sanctions on the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, placing sanctions on some private companies. Those private companies are also doing trade or the business with United States also want to sell weapons to us. So we have to leverage our relationship with the United States in such a way that the strategic sales which are there from Russia, the S-400, the stealth brigades, our helicopters, these issues do not get blocked. I think we will be able to manage it by leveraging our foreign policy as well as our economic and engagement with Russia. With the United States, as well as finding mechanisms to deal with Russia, like we have this sort of a triangular mechanism or something like that. Thank you.
So, to Moscow, yes, very briefly. We talk about this very often. India, for the United States, is a very important partner. So the United States can pressure India, as President Trump likes to do it, but the United States does understand that they cannot lose the Indian market, and there were explanations provided and comments provided by James Mattis, who asked not to pressure too much India, Indonesia, and Vietnam, because the geopolitical element of these ties is very much important. So for this reason, I think that the reporter who asked this question should not be worried. Any comments? Yes, Mr. Volodin said what I wanted to say. I would like to praise India that for its sovereignty, for standing up for its sovereignty. So all the rhetoric before the 2+2 meeting between India and the US was about sanctions, but after that Mike Pompeo said that probably we will not pressure India too much. So, but the United States can even sanction the EU. Another question from Moscow. A question from Sputnik. A question to Mr. Kupriyanov. You've mentioned North-South corridor. There was a visit by Uzbekistan president to India, and what what role could be Central Asia play in this corridor? We have to understand that North-South corridor is not a single route. It has several alternatives. It is one of these lines, and we want a direct line through Astrakhan, through the Caspian Sea, or through the Caucasus republics. And we expect India to be, and Central Asian countries to be interested in having this line extended toward India. Central Asian countries need India to counterbalance China's interests, for example. This was an expected visit, and of course it will play an important role in making India interested in extending this corridor. And we would like India to be mindful of this North-South transport corridor. And New Delhi, you have a question there or not? Any questions from Delhi?
So this question is for you also, and from our Russian counterparts also. Recently we have seen that I'm Abhishek Jha. I'm from GD News, and I want to know. Recently we have seen Russia and Pakistan have this military exercise, and there is also talk of some weaponry trade between Russia and Pakistan. So how does this augur well with the kind of long-standing military ties that India and Russia have had? And we should also keep in mind that India and Pakistan have been adversary over these years. So these weaponaries and military exercise, obviously they'll be used against India in some time. So how does this augur, this concept of Indo-Russia ties and Russia-Pakistan new ties?
So,
Well, I think you have to look at this issue in the light of logic. There is no sanction on Pakistan, so Russia is free to have relations with Pakistan, to sell arms to Pakistan if it wishes, and to develop its relations with Pakistan. And India has not imposed sanctions on Pakistan, and therefore no one is violating any of the laws of India by interacting with Pakistan. The second thing is, if you look at the logic of defense diplomacy, then by the same logic, the United States sells a large number of arms to Pakistan, and the United States is a strategic partner of India, knowing that the arms it sells to Pakistan can only be used against India. So we do not raise this concern when the United States is doing the same thing with Pakistan. I think the logic needs to be understood, and similarly with China. China is supplying arms to Pakistan, which can only be used against India. And yet, this issue probably is not raised in the same way. So I think the logic of defense exports and defense diplomacy, which Brigadier has mentioned, that logic is in its own framework. But the larger strategic dimension, which is behind your question, that can only be answered by what has happened on the ground. And so far, if you look at India's security interests, Russia is the only country which has cast its veto in the Security Council for India 5 times. No other permanent member of the Security Council, including any other strategic partners we have today, have ever taken this public stand in favor of India's interests. Most recently was during the Bangladesh war. So I think that this is something that needs to be looked at in a broader perspective, the strategic perspective. And the trust, I go back to the trust that is behind the India-Russia relationship. That is the trust that keeps this relationship going. Even today in the United Nations, Russia is a very close partner of India, although India is not in the Security Council. but Russia does a lot to help India, especially with respect to assistance for India's troops who are deployed on UN peacekeeping in Africa in very difficult conditions. The help that we get from Russia in the Security Council is known to the diplomatic elites who deal with Russia. So this is something that speaks for itself, and I think that's what I would like to say.
I just wanted to make a point that I think a number of those who have really tangoed with Pakistan realize, or ultimately realize, that it's not a reliable ally or partner in the long run. And I think as far as India-Russia relationship and the Pakistan dimension is concerned, there's a complete dehyphenation, and there has been a dehyphenation, perhaps except in 1965 when there was a proactive effort to bring about a settlement. I think it's going to be that way. And he has explained it best, but I just wanted to make this point that in the effort to strengthen a multipolar world order, it is India and Russia together, and the India-Russia special strategic partnership together is going to play a very crucial role. And therefore, I think there's a complete dehyphenation as far as Russia-Pakistan relationship. And I think it's very peripheral as far as.
I'd just like to add, you raised a very relevant question. In fact, this question keeps coming up whenever we have India and Moscow, New Delhi and Moscow dialogue. And when maybe 3 years or 4 years back, when this whole thing started between Russia and Pakistan, we really were concerned about it. And I would go by your concerns at that point of time. But today what has happened, that we have understood the logic, as the ambassador has very correctly said, the logic behind Russia engaging with Pakistan. And as Dr. Ganguly has said, that the trust that is there, I mean, nobody can really have that much of trust with Pakistan because of, the factors which are involved. So I think today we are reasonably comfortable about the relationship which is existing between Russia and Pakistan. And I'm sure that will work to our advantage. Now, on one hand we talk of multipolar world, on the other hand we say, no, you don't engage with so-and-so, and etc., etc. Tomorrow Russia will say, okay, you don't engage with the US. So, I mean, that sort of a friction cannot be accepted in a multipolar world order. As far as the sales are concerned, they are very minimal, 3 or 4, whatever helicopters are being given to Pakistan. They are not as a major. But yes, every time somebody says, okay, Su-57 is being sold, I think these stories we have to discount. These stories some of them are really planted by people who are not in interest of Russia and India better relations. And that is the way I would look at it. Thank you.
Пожалуйста.
Please, Mr. Volodin, I would like to add, I fully agree what our distinguished colleague in Delhi have said. I'm not going to make any remarks that could be viewed as interference in relations between Pakistan and India. But I have to point out that the economy of Pakistan is 1/8 part of the Indian economy. The Pakistan's economy is less than the GDP of Maharashtra state. And I would like to add that Russia has showed a number of times that relations with India should not suffer in any way from Russia's initiatives to promote relations with Pakistan. When there was this Indian-Pakistani conflict aggravated and escalated, Mr. Kadakin, the ambassador, the Russian ambassador, was the first ambassador who supported India in the conflict with Pakistan. And I would like to say, and I've heard from Indian journalists questions, alarming questions about Russia's cooperation with Pakistan, military cooperation. I would like to tell Indian journalists that I wish that we had more Indian officers studying in Russian military institutions than Pakistani officers. Unfortunately, we're out of time. This was very engaging and insightful conversation. We will follow the upcoming visit, and we will probably meet afterwards to discuss the outcomes. I thank you all for your contributions, and looking forward to seeing you at our events, and thank you very much.
Moscow, thank you. All the best wishes to everybody.